Benchmark Business Sales and Valuations proudly presents the Meaning Business Podcast, hosted by Bruce Kudre and Peter Spinder. This is the podcast for anyone serious about buying, selling, and preparing your business for maximum growth.
So, welcome to Meaning Business, the podcast presented by Benchmark Business Sales and Valuations for business owners and people who are looking to buy a business, anyone interested in small business. I'm Bruce Kudre, the principal of Benchmark Business Sales and Valuations. We're a national company, and today I have with me Peter Spinder, who usually joins us for these podcasts.
Thank you again.
Welcome, Peter. And we have a special guest today, a gentleman named Brian Sander, who's based in Adelaide. Brian's been a broker for 30, 40... you wouldn't know to look at him, perhaps even 50 years. A long time, has great experience, great reputation. We're really proud to be able to work with Brian. So we've invited Brian along today to talk to us about how business brokerage has changed and where it's heading in the future. So welcome, Brian.
Hi, Bruce.
So do you want to give us a bit of background about how you got started and just quickly about how you fell into business broking?
Yes, I was a director in a real estate company here in Adelaide a long time ago, and part of my role was to manage. We had 10 different offices. Part of my role was to manage 6 of those offices, and one of those offices, under the direction of its sales manager, decided it would be nobody in South Australia was handling professionally in the sale of businesses. He believed there was an opening there. So he asked me to persuade the board to allow us to create a business sales team. Business sales was incredibly amateurish at that stage. It was there was no professionalism in it. There were no financials provided to clients. There were no documentation. It was a sort of show somebody a business and say, if you want to buy it, there it is. And that was about, and you took a lot of risks in doing that. He and subsequently our board decided we needed to bring it up into the 20th century and the 21st century, and decided to take some steps to make business broking a little bit more professional. We were assisted in some ways by the government of the day. South Australia in those days was run by Don Dunstan, who was very strong in consumer protection. And he agreed that there should be some introduction into the act that governed the sale of real estate in South Australia, that buyers were entitled to get protection. They should be given a level of figures, and they should also be given a cooling off. Today, 50 years later, South Australia is still the only state in Australia where a buyer gets a cooling off when they purchase a business, right? He was a long way in front of his time.
So let's just go back. Sorry, Brian. Let's just go back a step before we move too far. So this guy that was in the office, did you say that you were supposed to get rid of him, to sack him? Was that part of the story?
It was part of the story.
Right.
As a real estate manager, he was not performing. And the board made the decision that it was my job to go and tell him that he was fired, right? And I was quite a bit younger than this gentleman. He was a very imposing man. He was about 6'6" tall, with silver hair, sort of almost well below his ears and sort of almost down to his shoulders, but not quite. Dressed impeccably, of course, because in his previous life, he had actually been the fashion director at one of Australia's major department stores, David Jones. So he knew presentation, and he had a wonderful way with words, and I had to sit in front of him and tell him that I was firing him.
Did you tell him that?
He countered by saying, no, I don't think you should do that. I think what you should do is go back to the board and say, I've had a brilliant idea. I'm going to create a division in our company that sells businesses, because no other real estate company in South Australia is selling businesses in a professional way. After half an hour, he convinced me, because I said to him, I know nothing about business sales. How are you going to do that? He said, I'll show you how to do it. I've got it all thought out. He must have known I was coming to sack him. I think he thought this through beforehand. Anyway, we went back. We persuaded the board that it would be an idea to give us 6 months. They gave us 6 months. Within 12 months, he had turned that division, the business selling division, into the most profitable team in the whole 10 branches that we had. And I was the golden-haired boy who brought it to the director. So I was riding along on the top of that. This must have been a very good idea I had.
But the thing is that you probably failed because you were sent there to sack him, and instead of that, you started this new division. Happy accident.
And I mean, this gentleman and I had a long history together. We subsequently moved, and then 3 or 4 years later, I created my own business broking team in South Australia. And in a very short while after that, he joined me as my general manager. And we ran a fairly successful business broking team until he died. Sadly, he died of a heart attack in the office. He was never going to give up. He was never going to stop selling. He was there to the last day.
So Brian, just you mentioned it, just going back into those first 12 months. So you convinced the board, fantastic, brilliant, brand new idea, brand new concept to the South Australian market. What was it that made the concept so successful? What made it so successful that after 12 months became the most profitable division?
I think what it was, what we recognized that prior to that, there had been, as I said, no expectation from the public that there would be any level of professionalism from a business broker. They expected some degree of professionalism from real estate sales agents, but not necessarily business brokers. So what we did was we created a level of professionalism. We set standards, and we determined that the way we were going to gather information to be able to present that information to the buyers. We were going to develop a method under which we could assess what a business was worth. No one had ever really worked out prior to that, how do you value what a business is worth? So we actually had to decide what standards were we going to use to determine what a business was worth. How were we going to document that? How were we going to present that to buyers? We did that with, I can proudly say, a high level of professionalism, right? It flowed through South Australia. We got copied, and I know it's been copied. I'm not going to say South Australia started it, but certainly a lot of things that started in South Australia in those days, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, flowed into business broking across Australia as the Australian Institute of Business Brokers grew, and we became members, and we brought our ideas into that. People learned of things that we had in South Australia, as I said, such as the cooling off, such as a vendor's document where the vendor, by law, had to tell the buyer a lot of information and had to provide financials signed off by their accountant, had to present this information in a professional way. Buyers started to have confidence that they could buy a business and believe what they were being shown was true and accurate about the business.
And isn't that interesting? And we can actually look at the business landscape today, and we can say to any business owner listening here that in fact, what you're saying still rings true today, that in today's business, you still need openness, transparency, honesty, communication. And especially in today's digital world, where often people are transacting through the web, we don't have the physicality of, the interaction. People want that. In fact, they're probably wanting it even more from today's business owners, don't they? That if I'm going to order something online, I want the communication. I want the confidence to know that the service provider is going to deliver, that the product I'm going to buy is what I'm buying.
Peter, I have said in training brokers over 40, 50 years, the most important factor is nobody does any type of business with anybody that they do not trust. The most important thing as a business broker that we have to establish from day one, with not only with our vendor, but with our purchaser, is a level of trust that they can believe what we are saying, that we are speaking truthfully to them. In this digital world, it is too small. If you lie to people, you will be found out and caught out, and nobody will ever believe you again.
Absolutely.
So just going back to the old days, the good old days, did you say, Brian, that there wasn't many business brokers, and most of them were basically kind of migrants that had or ethnic sort of groups that were selling businesses then?
You look in the history of almost every state, the original business brokers invariably were Italian and Greek ex-real estate people who had friends who had small shops, right? Delicatessens, greengrocers, butchers, and got involved selling all that. So I know certainly in Adelaide, these periods I'm talking about, the late 70s, early 80s, there were probably 3 or 4 business broking firms that existed, 1 or 2 man organizations. I think they were all either Italian or Greek, and all they did was sell delis and greengrocery shops.
Yeah.
That was it.
So
The broking world of the 70s and 80s.
They were trailblazers. Now, the same thing was in Queensland in the 70s and 80s. There was this area called West End in Brisbane where there was a very highly concentrated Greek population. So a lot of people would come to Australia and buy businesses, well, great businesses, but they had no financials. So the way they would transact a business sale was by a trial, and trial became a very popular way of selling businesses in Queensland, where you would come in to the greengrocer or the deli or the fish and chip shop. Fish and chip shops are quite popular. And you would, no figures. So Pete, you like it. You come in, you agree that you're going to pay $300,000 for my business. You come in for 2 weeks. If it does $40,000 a week, like I said it will, you buy it. If it doesn't, you don't have to buy it. And you would sign a contract. And even today, that provision is still within the business sale contract in Queensland, which emanated from that West End area of Brisbane.
For businesses that were dealing totally in cash have always been prominent, because how else do you prove what the business is really doing? Is it by sitting there behind the counter and watching it? Yeah.
And you can imagine what would happen during the trials, right? You know what would happen. Mario's selling the business. All the family are coming to buy fish and chips for that week.
40,000 revenue, and then after that, plogs.
What happened?
What about the other businesses? So what if you're not a grocer or any of those sort of businesses? What were they doing?
Who was selling the bigger businesses back in those days?
Well, I can only assume that owners were selling them or accountants' firms were selling them. I mean, that was part of what we did in the 70s and 80s. We attacked the broader market, recognized that if you understood how to sell a delicatessen or a fish and chip shop, then you understood how to sell a supermarket, which was simply a larger version of a delicatessen. Then if you understood that, you understood how to go and sell a small manufacturing business, and then a larger manufacturing business, and then an engineering business. And suddenly, business brokering was covering every type of business that existed. It took a period of time. It took 10 years at least for that to grow and that concept to be understood. But slowly, the people began to realize that that's what business brokers did. They worked in that field and understood how to sell businesses. And slowly we built that set side of the business up till it got to the point that there was virtually no business that we would not handle. Well, there was one business, I have to say, I didn't want to handle. I got run by a vet practice who told me that they had this booming part of their business where they sold animals that had been put down to various other businesses that used those parts. I just listened to it, and as an animal lover, I said, I don't think I could get involved selling like that. To the best of my memory, in 40-odd years, it's the only business I've ever turned down, even wanting to get involved with.
Yes. That's understandable. I wonder if anyone ever bought it.
I don't know.
But, we look at how in the old days the bigger businesses were sold by the owners or accountants, and how brokerage has got into that space. I would suggest that that's actually still happening. If you look at the average transaction size of business brokerage, say 5 or 10 years ago, it was probably under $1 million maybe. Now it's well over 2 million. And the average transaction size is growing as business brokerage around the world becomes a more viable and profession.
It's a profession.
And offers greater value. You know, back in those days when the migrants were selling fish and chip shops with trials, business brokerage wasn't a big thing, and we weren't selling bigger businesses but once we'd started to sell them, we were adding value. We were increasing the competition for those sorts of businesses. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I remember the very first time one of my staff listed a business that the value was over $100,000. We've never had a business to sell that where the value was over $100,000. We were breaking a new boundary. We'd never believed that business brokers would be involved selling businesses of that magnitude.
Isn't that crazy? Well, and then, you know, the next barrier was $1 million, and the next barrier was 10 million perhaps, which we've broken through. And I think for me, one of the barriers was getting to the point where we could get involved in a company floating on the stock exchange. That was a big barrier. You know, now we've smashed that barrier. And every time you go through that barrier, you learn a little more, right? You know a little more about funding or who you're dealing with or due diligence and those sorts of things. I mean, when you got started, due diligence wouldn't have been a thing, I'm sure, Brian.
I'd never heard of the word that.
Good as fella.
If you'd have asked me what that meant, I'd have thought, is that something to do with dew dropping in the mornings? It is due diligence. But yes, obviously now, I mean, it's very interesting because I don't believe in any state of Australia there is any legal requirement on a business broker to give a purchaser due diligence. But every business broker in any state, if they make a sale, gives the buyer due diligence as a matter of course, right? We offer them something that there's no legal requirement to do to make sure that they are comfortable with what they are buying. As I said, if you can't have trust, if people don't trust you, they will never deal with you. The fact that we do offer them things that there's not a legal entitlement, we want to say to them, if you're going to move forward with this business, we want you to be absolutely 100% confident that this is the right business and that what we have told you is correct, what the owner has told you is correct. So please double check everything and only proceed if you are totally sure and comfortable. There used to be all those horror stories. It's interesting, Bruce. There used to be horror stories and people would say, oh, I've heard of a story of somebody who bought a business that they were told was doing $10,000 a week. And after they bought it, they discovered it was only doing $5,000 a week and they paid much too much money for it. And, they're now suing the client. You don't hear those stories anymore because people don't fall for those issues because they do due diligence. They get a business check, and we do. We do the due diligence before we even put a business on the market. Just for an owner to say to us, my business does $10,000 a week, is very nice, but we don't believe that until we have seen financials prepared by an independent accountant and we make sure those financials are correct. And therefore, we can say with confidence, this business is doing $10,000 a week because this evidence shows that. So we, I guess, double check, and the buyers can have that confidence that we've checked the businesses out before we bring them to the market because it's our reputation that's on the line behind that business. We're not going to sell a business that's only doing $5,000 a week and tell you it's doing $10,000.
Yeah. Sure. I guess one of the things we know is that by setting the right price, you sell the business properly. And if you overprice it, you're not going to sell it. And if you underprice it, you're not going to get the right result either. And so to get the price right, we need to do the due diligence ourselves to understand how the business works, what the profit looks like, to value it anyway. That's one of those big changes.
There's a quotation that you've read somewhere that says a business that's been well listed is 80% sold.
Yes. I know who said that first, or at least quoted you.
That might have been.
What's interesting is
that'll be on his headstone.
That will be. But as you two are talking, I'm sort of sitting here thinking, you know what? Business broking has truly evolved into a profession because as we're talking about due diligence and we're talking about the numbers and things like that, the reality is that today's business broker needs to understand how to do these things, how to undertake these activities, the investigations, which means they need to understand how to read a balance sheet, a profit and loss statement, how to chat to an accountant, a lawyer, how to be a business professional themselves in order to understand how to advise. And in fact, we're becoming advisors.
So that's changed a lot in my time. You used to read a P&L and understand the profit. But now we've got to get into the balance sheet to understand work in progress, the working capital requirement, how we're going to fund this transaction, whether there's a retention required to maximise value, whether it's a share sale or an asset sale. All these things have changed so much. I just want to jump in and talk about that for a sec. So, you know, Brian, if you think about it, when we started, there was no confidentiality. I remember in the 90s when I started selling businesses, we used to put an ad in the paper every Saturday. The paper would be full, the classifieds would be full of businesses for sale. You go into the office at 7:30 and wait for the phone to ring or a fax to come through. And then you'd have buyers come into the office at 10, 11, 12. You'd talk to them about the business. And you were a champion if you'd signed them up, got a contract, and you'd be down at the pub 5 o'clock on Saturday.
Good day's work.
Another deal done. No due diligence. No, and the other thing that changed, and this I'll get you to talk about this, there was no accountants or lawyers involved really. People just made their decision on their own. Would you see that that's changed as well?
Oh, enormously. I mean, because we provide so much more information, as I said, that, you know, the classics of a buyer walking in, talking to you about a business, and you would give them a piece of paper that the owner had drawn up and say, well, you know, there's the figures. Now we're going to have a look at it. If you like it, you know, we'll sign a contract. That doesn't happen. Buyers expect, and we provide, and that's why I think buyers' expectation has followed what we have done by giving them so much more. I mean, the degree of professionalism in an information memorandum that most business brokers in Australia now prepare with detailed 4 years figures, analysis of the financials, all of that is provided to a buyer. Now, some buyers understand it, some buyers actually don't know how to read all that information, so they go to their accountant. So accountants do get involved. But accountants can also then see that the level of information we are giving, we do understand what we're talking about with our businesses. We are giving, accountants are impressed. No, I've had many accountants tell me that, you know, how impressed they are with the degree of information provided in an information memorandum or a profile, as some brokers call it. And it helps the accountant to advise his client when he can look at it and say, yes, well, this is a good business. Look at what they've given you. You can see the figures are consistent. You can see there's a good lease here. You can see all the information that you need to feel confident that this business is something that will go forward in time and you will be successful with this business.
So do you think it's a lot harder now than it used to be?
Is it a lot harder?
You need to think about that for a minute.
Yeah, it's a lot more complex, right? We have made it more complex because we provide so much more. Whereas I think it used to be a quicker decision. They weren't spending quite as much money either. And they would make a decision based on a gut feeling. I find buyers are much more educated these days and look for much more information, analyse that information, and want to feel comfortable with the information before they go to that next stage. So it takes longer to sell.
But the other thing is that if it is harder, which I believe it is, it means that the cowboys don't bother trying to pursue a career as a broker because it's too hard.
Yeah, just quick bucket.
Yes. In the old days, anyone could just come along, put a for sale sign on a business, come on in, you know, have a look, here's a bit of paper. If you like it, buy it. There's no place for those guys these days.
Oh, I think the traditional old white shoe cowboy has long gone.
Do you think what's also changed is if we sort of think about the business transaction and we know the broker's role, do you think the business owner's role has also changed in the sense that we need to have a business to be ready to be sold, which means it has to have certain things in place. We know things like processes, systems, right, financials and things like that. So do you think, Brian, that business owners now have more sort of the need to step up in order to help facilitate the sale of the business? They can't just go, here, go sell it. They actually have to do more, work harder in the back end.
I think they do, and I think they have to think about it earlier. I mean, again, there was a time where somebody would suddenly make a decision, I want to sell my business and ring a broker, he'd have it on the market the next day. These days, to be able to maximise the value for their business owners need to think about it in advance and have planned it, have prepared themselves and got systems maybe in place, maybe put some management in below them so that the business is not totally dependent upon the owner. Certainly to have sometimes got their financials looking as best, their very best, so that they will achieve the best price possible for their business. I mean, Bruce would know, we've worked with businesses for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years at sometimes to get them ready for sale.
So does that mean that the broker's role has obviously changed as well? So we've gone from being the white shoes, hatted cowboys, if I can put it that way, to being your partner on your business journey. We're working with you. We're building a longer term relationship. It's not about let's list and sell today, but let's help you so that we can maximize and impact the sale in 2 years potentially.
So I'll say something about that, and then Brian can comment. So business ownership has changed. In the 70s and 80s, most people worked in their business that they owned. So they were really buying a job, not a business. Now most people, it is a business and they work on it, not in it, as they should. And they now understand people. I think it'd be interesting to see what Brian thinks. Most business owners are starting to turn around, it hasn't happened across the board yet, and realise I need to prepare my business for exit. It's just becoming a thing. I don't think it's been prevalent until just in the last couple of years. What do you think, Brian?
Yep. No, I think people do realise, or are slowly realising, that if you want to get the maximum out of your business, you need to plan a sale, plan the exit, think about it, talk to a professional, talk to a broker, and say, what am I, have a look at my business, tell me its strengths and its weaknesses now, tell me how I can improve it to get more for it.
And I should say, one of Brian's many strengths is he's a trainer, he's a great presenter, and also a good business broker, but Brian's a business valuer as well. And one of the emerging trends, I think, Brian, is that the trend for business owners to get their business valued regularly, one every year or every 2 years, so they can sort of test their equity and see where their business is at, and also determine what they can do to add value to their business for when they do decide it's time to sell.
Absolutely. You are aware that I spoke with you only yesterday about a business that we did a valuation for 12 months ago.
Yes.
Just contacted us yesterday to say, can you do an upgrade because we had a better year? We'd like to see what effect that's had on our business. So
yes,
that's an intelligent business owner who
absolutely
sell their business and maximize what they're going to get for their business.
So thinking about how the profession has changed or become a profession, there was no business valuers around when you started, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And now? Now plenty.
Well, there are more.
Yeah.
There's still a rarity, someone who has the qualifications and experience to be a proper business valuer, but there's certainly a lot more than there used to be.
But you look at the frequency of the valuation jobs that you're given, and it's rising year on year. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is a good thing.
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely.
And I should tell Peter that one of the reasons why Brian's able to provide accurate business valuations to clients is because he has the market evidence. As business brokers, we have that data, that information on what's selling. The business that Brian's been asked to sell is a niche business in the building industry or building supply. And we've got the data because of the businesses that we've sold to be able to assess what those things are selling for. An accountant or another financial advisor would not have the access to the market evidence that we have to be able to accurately give people business valuations. That's a huge step forward.
I've done valuations for court matters for, parties in dispute over certain things, is that we can, to the court, produce evidence to back up what we say the valuation is worth.
And I think, I could be wrong in the number here, but I reckon Brian would have been averaging 3 or 4 valuations a month this year. Would that be right?
Be close to that.
Yeah. That's a lot more than you would have been doing 10 years ago, I reckon.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It might have been 3 or 4 a year.
Yeah. And it's just going to grow. So that's another thing I believe where the future of not just business brokerage, but business ownership and operating businesses is, the future is to get a more accurate look at what your business is doing. Be honest with yourself. The great thing is people are being more honest about their numbers and their position and their situation, their strengths and weaknesses, and using a valuation as a metric for where they're standing is becoming a really important and well-used tool.
So that's interesting. So on that sort of line of thought, Brian, we've spoken about, where it's all started and where we're at the moment. Where do you think we headed? What do you see as the future of broking and, in fact, business owning in Australia over the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, I believe it's only going to grow. We have an aging population. There are lots and lots of business owners approaching that age of retirement. The number of business brokers in Australia has not hugely increased. So I think there's going to be a lot more work around. There'll be a lot more people looking to talk to brokers. There's no limit. I mean, as Bruce said, we've sort of pushed the value of businesses that we sell maybe up into the $5 to $10 million range, right? I don't know that there's any different skills in selling a business that's worth $5 million to there is in selling a business that's worth $50 million. You're only talking of extra dollars and extra numbers, but the skills and the understanding are the same. So if you as brokers have got accomplished at selling businesses in that medium range, there is no reason why you won't have brokers who are specialising in bigger sales, far bigger sales than that.
So, okay, we're talking about the future. What about robots and AI? Do you think robots and artificial intelligence will replace business brokers?
I don't see how they can. As I've said, a lot of where a successful business broker develops a basis of trust, that the clients trust him as an individual, know that they can deal with him and they will not be misled. Very difficult to do that with a robot or with AI. You're not really dealing with an individual. So the human touch, I think, in sales, the human touch is something that you can never really replace.
I agree with you 100%. I personally believe the human touch will always be absolutely critical. I think the AI will play a role in some of the back-end processes, assist in things. But the reality is that if you can look someone straight in the eye at a physical meeting, shake the hands and build that trust, all of a sudden you have a different dynamic and a different relationship moving forward. And I agree with you, Brian. I think we're still going to be human beings in the next 50 to 100 years. We're not, robots. I think that's going to be critical. And that's probably a good message, isn't it, for up and coming brokers and current brokers, that you've got to maintain the relationships and keep focusing on building relationships.
Communicate with your clients, be someone that they believe in, that they can depend on, that they can rely on. Prove to them that they can rely on you by being true to your word, being straightforward and being honest. There is no substitution for any of that, right? The successful brokers, that's what they are.
There's one other thing that's changed a lot, and we're going to wrap it up in a second. I might even finish on this note unless Brian wants to add something at the end. One thing that's changed since the 70s and 80s, and that's the fashion. You mentioned Ron Jones, the guy that you worked with, who obviously was a snappy dresser. I've seen photos of Brian in a safari suit. I think I might put it up on this podcast later. And the fashion has certainly changed since then, hasn't it, Brian?
Yes, it certainly has.
Because you used to wear a tie to work, right? You don't wear a tie every day these days.
COVID used to do that a lot, Bruce. I mean, yes, I would get up for 40 years, get up, shower, put on a suit, white shirt, tie, and go to work, right?
Yeah.
I have to say sometimes it's a little more relaxing to be just a little bit more casual. I may not wear a pinkish coloured shirt if I'm going to see a client, but yeah, I think it's totally acceptable to be a little bit more casual and relaxed. And I certainly feel just as professional and just as efficient whether I'm wearing a suit or whether I'm wearing a casual open neck shirt.
It makes us more human, doesn't it?
As long as we've got clothes on, I think that's the main thing.
I have a drawer full of ties that haven't seen the light of day for 5 years.
They're going to come back one day. That big floral tie, it's going to come back one day. Probably be a clown wearing it, but it'll come back. Anyway, look, Brian, it's been great to share a few things with you today and take advantage of the experience that you've got as a business broker. So hopefully people have enjoyed our little chat today, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Chris.